Welcome to the Rock Ag Podcast. This is your host, Garrard Coffey, Ag and Natural Resource Agent for the University of Kentucky in Rockcastle County. Today, we will be joined by Dr. Matthew Springer, Assistant Extension Professor of Wildlife Management for the University of Kentucky. We'll be discussing food plots, how to plan for food plots, and how to implement those on your farm or in your wildlife habitat.
Thanks for joining us today, Dr. Springer. We're glad to have you on. We're going to discuss some wildlife food plots today and try to figure out what we need to be doing and where we need to be planning and some things to think about for our wildlife plots coming up for this year. So glad to have you on. We appreciate you taking the time to talk to us today. The first question I have for you is that, so we're at the end of February, right around the 1st of March. And what are some things that you would say that I need to start planning for my food plot?
Sure.
Where do I need to start thinking?
Yeah, so I'm glad to be here, and thanks for inviting me on. I think, most important thing to start out with, if you're thinking about a food plot, is you want to do a few things. You want to take stock of what is on your property and what's surrounding your property where you think you may want to put a food plot. You want to know what is available to these animals. What are they basically? Are they have a lot of food already? Do they have food only during certain periods of time? Spring, summer, fall, and they're missing a lot of winter food source, or vice versa. So you want to kind of take stock of what's on your property and what's around your property, and then when you identify that void, you want to try to fill it. Now, you also have to keep in mind, what are you going to use this food plot for? Is it trying to raise the nutritional value of the property to these animals? Or is it you're going to use this for photography, or the most popular reason, right, is hunting? So if that's the reason, then you have to think about, am I going to try to put this in so I can have animals using the food plot during hunting season, which could potentially alter your plans. But first and foremost, after you kind of take stock of the situation, you want to identify a location on the property that'll work, that you have access to, that you can get in with the equipment you need to put the food plot in, that you can, make sure that you're able to keep up with maintenance and looking for weeds, treat it as needed, and then take a soil sample. Definitely need a soil sample. Right. You go from a wildlife manager to you're now a farmer. So start thinking like a farmer. What does my soil look like? What does it potentially need? And that's where you kind of come in, right, as the county agent and helping that process move along. And there's we do have ample resources out there on how to go about that. And to be honest, you guys are way better at that process in terms of knowledge and what should happen than I am. So my comment usually is talk to your county agent at this point and let them kind of guide you through what you need to do.
I think whenever we take soil samples, one thing that I always need to ask someone whenever we're talking about a soil sample is that I'm going to have different recommendations for clovers as opposed to growing wheat crops, or as opposed to growing something like turnips or those kind of things. So, to have that knowledge ahead of time to kind of know the direction that you want to go with your food plot really helps out for our recommendations on soil tests as well.
Absolutely. And, that whole taking stock part, and what I kind of skipped over there is that kind of helps you understand what you may be interested in planting. You kind of need to make that decision, as you said, before you go get that soil sample, because the recommendations are going to be geared towards what you're thinking about planting.
Yeah.
And to be honest, a monoculture food plot is not usually the best thing. We generally advise folks to try to plant multiple species that are going to interact with each other in a beneficial way. For example, if you want to use turnips, you plant it with winter wheat as a nursery crop. And then you can frost seed it with clover when the turnips are done. And all of a sudden you got a pretty good mix going on there for food sources that vary in both nutritional quality and availability.
That was something that I had written down on my notes here, is that, if we're obviously, we need to think about what kind of species we want to attract, but also, with that multi-species crop, we're, I think, going to attract some multi-species as far as the wildlife that come to it.
Yes, sir. Yeah. And, it doesn't necessarily need to be that mix. I mean, there's a lot of folks like planting corn for a food plot. There's several things that we'll mix in with that that'll grow up underneath the corn, especially thinking like cover crops, right? So we use cover crops in farming, and usually we seed them after that corn is already up and they start growing. Well, those cover crops are providing a food source. As that corn starts to go out, those cover crops are usually greening up and nutritional quality is increasing. So anytime you can find mixes that'll work together, it's a good thing. Monocultures are great. A clover field has value. However, it's a whole lot better if there's 3 or 4 other things in there with it, for sure.
Right. So on that, I'm looking. So it's kind of rolls right into the next question: is what should we be looking at to seed in our mixtures? And one question that I have, you've kind of started on that already, but a lot of times I see advertised in magazines or at outdoor stores, and they have these special clover blends, and some of them are going to be expensive. And, I can run down here to my local farm store and get some clover seed for probably $3-4 a pound. Are we really going to see a great benefit to using those wildlife mixtures, or, what's your opinion on that?
Well, every seed is made different, right? And every seed company packages things differently. There's always concerns whenever you buy a seed mix from somewhere that, you're getting what you're actually buying, right? You're not getting a whole bunch of other weed seeds mixed in there. So, there's basic concerns with that. So you don't necessarily want to buy the rock bottom prices because you want to make sure that you're not introducing something into the field that shouldn't be there. However, when you pick up a bag of food plot mix at a store, it could be a brand name, it could be generic. You want to look at things, that we would normally look at for farmers, your seeding rate per acre. And you start, breaking that down, looking at how much does this cost to plant this per acre versus the generic. And sometimes the generic may require a higher seeding rate. So it may be less per pound cost wise, but may require more seed. So you want to look at those two things rather than looking at the major nutritional differences in the seed itself. Because realistically, being in Kentucky and the quality of soils that we have, the vegetation quality is directly correlated with those soils. Our wildlife species really are not food limited or nutritionally limited in this state. Now, there's some exceptions where you look in eastern Kentucky in the hills where they're heavily dependent upon mast. If it's a bad mast year, that's a year that they're probably going to be looking for food sources to help carry them through. But if you're thinking about, is this food plot going to give you a bigger antler? Is Mineralix going to give you a bigger antler? The science actually doesn't back that up.
Okay.
It's food plots are really good for one thing. They attract animals to a certain location, and in extreme weather events, they can help potentially carry them through, like we just experienced, right?
Yeah.
But in terms of whether or not you need to spend that extra $150 an acre on a brand name seed, it's probably not going to translate to bigger antlers if that's what you're hoping for.
Okay. Well, I know one thing that we always recommend, or that I do anyway, I was actually in the seed business, farm supply business for a while, and to make sure that whatever you're seeding, make sure that it's certified seed. Like you said, make sure that it's not just something that you're going to get some weed seeds or, inert matter and stuff. So we always recommend to buy those certified seeds, whatever you're buying, for sure. Okay. So with that, and I like the way that you kind of rolled into the wheat and the turnips and the frost seeded clovers a while ago. And, we're looking, we need to plan ahead for what we want to attract and what we're trying to feed at the time and when we want them to be there. So, if we want, when should we start seeding? When do we need to start thinking about seeding specific like clovers and that kind of stuff? When do you see that?
Sure. So, whenever you decide what you're going to pick, you want to start looking at, the zone that you're in. The seed is going to have a recommended planting date. associated with that. The big thing that I like to talk about with this kind of question is, you got two major groups of options for food plots. You have your cool season and your warm season growing plants. So being March right now, we're not really thinking about planting cool season plants a whole lot in spring in March and April, because their growing season will basically be March and April, and then they're going to shut off because it's going to get too hot. So if you're thinking about planting things like corn, soybean, now would be a time that you need to start making your preparations to get that in the ground come April, May. If we're looking at cool season plants, and a lot of those will be growing during the vast majority of our hunting season, or through into December and January, you're looking at potential planting dates around August. There's some. It varies by what you're planting, but you're looking at April, May for summer, the warm season stuff, and late July, August, September for your cool season plants. So those are the kind of the timeframes you want to keep in mind. Now, there may be some preparation you need to do. So like if I was getting ready to plant a warm season mix here in May, I'm already going to be out there figuring out exactly what's going on. Where do I want to put this? Pull my soil samples and start thinking about how do I prep that ground to get my seed in there. And that could include some herbicide prep. That may include some soil disturbance, disking, completely plowing it up, so it kind of depends on each person's given situation. But, basically you're looking at the same starting steps of soil sample, setup, herbicide, soil disturbance, and then looking at your planting dates for your seed and seeding rates.
Yeah. Well, I know that a lot of times we, in July, I think, deer season's coming up here in September and October, and I'm going to seed some clover. But, that's typically not a great idea to be doing that, because you're not going to get the benefit out of it. The seed's not going to germinate and do like it should. So make sure that you are with the seeds and, the right planting dates and all that kind of stuff for sure. So in that, what size do these food plots need to be? Is there a certain size that I shouldn't go below? Is there a certain size that I shouldn't go over? What do that need to look like exactly?
Well, it kind of depends on the goals of the food plot. So if you're thinking that you're going to use this food plot for something like hunting, archery hunting especially, you may want to actually make a smaller food plot to try to concentrate those deer or the deer activity in a certain area. If you think that you're going to try to use the food plot, especially this happens down south where soil quality drops drastically, right? So you have incredibly clay soil. It's not as there's a lot of those nutrients are bound up in the soil and they don't get into that vegetative matter. Where food plots, where this really all this push came from is in the south, because their soil is so bad, and they will plant very large fields. Because the entire point of that food plot is basically just raise the nutritional availability to those animals. So all the forage that's out there, right? So a lot of folks are familiar with cattle. We just want to raise the forage quantity that's in the landscape to basically allow there to be more biomass that can be consumed. With Kentucky, I would say you don't necessarily need those large food plots, right? You mentioned how these animals really aren't nutritionally limited. So it depends on your goals. Now, if you're going to use the food plot for firearm hunting, they can be a lot larger, right? Your capability of being lethal is a little bit further. There's not evidence to point that one is more effective at attracting deer than another. It's kind of try to experiment with what works for you. What do you have equipment that allows you to do, right? So if you don't have access to a tractor, your ability to put a large food plot in is really difficult. Because there is some there's a scrape up, get a rake, you can rake up some soil and throw some stuff out, that you may be able to get like a 20th of an acre covered, but it may be enough to attract a deer to it. So It kind of depends on your given situation And I would say that you don't, anything that's like a quarter acre or half acre or below we'd call, a hunting plot for archery. But a lot of folks, acre 2, 3 is not uncommon. And anything that, if you're down south, anything that's over 5 acres is usually called a feeding plot, not necessarily a hunting plot.
Okay. Whenever we think about going out, and there's two parts to this question. The first part is that whenever we think about the location of this food plot, obviously there's places that are going to be more attractive to the wildlife in that, I've got a couple of hay fields that are probably 20 acres. I don't need to go in the center of that hay field where there's no cover close by to do a food plot. I mean, so probably along the edge of the woods, would you say would be a better in that situation?
Absolutely. You want to be, thinking about the purpose of the food plot. If you're going to hunt it, you're going to want to position these in almost a balancing act between how do I access this food plot without disturbing the wildlife versus how do I make it as accessible to the wildlife as possible where they feel comfortable in using it. So as you said, putting it in the middle of a hayfield, they're going to have to walk wide open to get there. That's not going to feel very good for them. If you have it right on the edge and there's, their bedding areas 100 yards away and there's a lot of cover, they're more likely to use that more frequently. So absolutely want to consider, where are the animals already using on your landscape, in your property, what areas are already being used and how do I put a food plot to make that balancing act work?
Yeah. So the other side of that is that, and we kind of talked about it just a little bit, but, if we're trying to get something very secluded in that we can't even, get maybe even a 4-wheeler ATV to it, to try to work up some ground, or is there some stuff that we can, maybe even go back under the trees and plant that would help, or are we going to need light for pretty much food plots on those?
Well, there are some mixtures that are sold that are meant for, the situation you're talking about. They're not going to be as successful in terms of the biomass that's produced, their competition, level with light. So you're not going to have this nice, very, thick stand of vegetative material. You may get these patches of growth where conditions were right. So if you go out there with a rake, you scrape up underneath a couple oaks, it's completely shaded. You throw out this mix that's meant to grow in the shade. You're probably going to have some growth that goes on. However, there's a lot of competition there that those seeds are going to compete against. So it's not going to be perfect, but it still may be enough to get that goal of attracting animals into that location. So it's not one that's you generally recommended to do because it's what you could call high risk, and so it's not as likely to be successful in terms of getting established. It's I would say go as far as you can go with the equipment you have and get it as secluded as possible. It'd be a better decision than trying to do one of those rake and throw kind of plots.
Yeah, we want to set it up for success and make sure that we're getting some benefit from it for sure, and more so even benefit to the wildlife that we're trying to attract to it for sure. So I'm gonna give you a quick scenario and let you answer it and say, here's what I would do in this situation. So I have a farm that's got a hay field on it that we cut some hay on, and I see a lot of deer obviously around the edges. They cross through it a lot. I see them. It's completely surrounded by woods, and I have a pretty good population of deer there. There's some really good bedding areas on both sides. And so talk about the location, and I want to attract a wide range of wildlife. I mean, whenever I say wide range, I'm talking about turkeys. It may be even quail. I do see a few of those. That's hard to imagine, I know, but I do see a few, and even some deer. And I'm going to, I want to benefit the wildlife, but I also want to use it for a hunting area as well. So kind of guide me through that.
Well, I got another question for you.
Okay.
Do you want to keep it as an income generating property with hay?
I do. Yes, sir.
Okay. That's an important part of this because if you had a field like that and you weren't as concerned about the income, I would tell you to contact NRCS and get a plan there and potentially put some native grasses in.
Yeah.
A pollinator mix would be one that, that's got a lot of wildlife benefits for a diverse group, from, the non-game species of the birds all the way up, the pollinators and all the way up, that those mixes have direct benefits on quail, turkey and deer and elk. So the ones, you could check off almost everything there. I would say that, if you want to, given the situation, you don't want to make any drastic changes. I would, benefits for quail and turkey would be if you can try to alter your cut times on the hay. I know that first cut is so important, but it's also like the worst possible time for turkey nesting and quail nesting, and fawning. It's tough. So what you potentially could do, and it's so weather driven, is you could try to cut, strips where you may be able to get the animals, go and cut a strip the first day, and the animals may, because of that disturbance, get out of the field. And therefore you have less of an impact. But I would, if you have cover for bedding and everything else, if you're looking to just improve things, you could try to put a food plot in. I got another question for you. What kind of mix is in the field? Is it just straight up fescue?
So we'll have a mix of, most of our hay fields are going to have primarily fescue orchard grass, and then with a little bit of legume in it. Yeah.
Okay. So if you feel like you can up that legume content, more clovers over time, obviously, you don't go in the area. That's a huge change. But that's going to have some benefit. You could go in that back corner. If you're willing to give up a corner of the property, you could put in you could put a food plot in. If you did, I would choose a mixture of, they've got some stuff out there that'll have a little bit of everything for deer, turkey, quail. It's got your plants that are going to have the smaller seeds for them. The big thing, unfortunately, one of the reasons we have a big decline in quail is the fescue fields are not great habitat for them. They have a hard time even just getting through them. They're not a great food source. So if you have any interest, one of the things that we would talk about is you could potentially, if you were open to switching to a native grazing, gamma grass, big blue stem switchgrass, Indian grass, which still could be used for grazing, haying, that is going to have a drastic increase in benefit to wildlife while still maintaining your production ability. And we're trying to push that right now in Kentucky, to be honest. But it's a national push to kind of diversify into some more warm season grasses. And even if you did, we're open to trying just like 2 or 3 acres at Back by the Woods, that would have a huge effect on the wildlife, just because of, one of the benefits to fescue orchard grass is there's not a whole lot of insect pests. Insect pests is food for quail and turkey. So it's just a transition. It's what you're willing to do. If you can alter your cutting time frame a little bit, or just try to change how you do things, it can have a pretty big benefit. However, you got to make a living, and I get that. Right. So doing that food plot's kind of like, if you can give up just a little bit, that would help. If you are open to bigger conversions, I would say that's going to have a much more of an impact, a positive impact on the wildlife in your property.
And then something, I'm glad you mentioned it just a minute ago, was through the NRCS is that the EQIP? Is that what that's listed under now?
So it depends on the practice.
Okay. But anyway, that is available. That is something that's available that you can, if you want to convert major portions, they will help you with that and do that.
Yeah. And, it's, in some situations, I think the pollinator program is still going. And that's a pretty lucrative program for folks if they are willing to take it out. Obviously, there's more to it than just say, oh, yeah, you can just take it out, right? But it's one that for certain folks, it may be worth at least asking about and get the information. The payments, the acreage payments are probably more than you'd make a year haying normally. However, there's obviously some land change there, and what happens if, like CREP, it goes away. There's concerns with that as well, and rightfully so.
Right. Definitely be something to discuss with several people if you were interested in something like that. Okay. Well, I think that's about all I have. Do you have any last thoughts for us before we go?
I guess the keep in mind with food plots, they are a very popular management tool for hunters. The big message, from the wildlife management side, the biologist side, a food plot is a tool that should be used. It should not be the only tool used. And to be honest, the recommendation is about 1% to 2% of the land area should be in a food plot. So all those other habitat pieces are much more important than food plots. So make sure you recognize if you need habitat, other habitat in your area, that should be more of a priority than a food plot. And then always reach out to your county ag agent or extension agent for help. And don't overlook the NRCS office, FSA office to help you try to accomplish some of these programs.
That's one thing that I always say in my podcast is that we have tons of resources. Come to the extension office. I mean, if I don't know, I can contact you, and I mean, we can come out and look at it, and we can check it out, and we can really send you down the right direction for sure.
Yeah, if it's outside of wildlife, I'm calling my agent in Franklin County. So I use the resource just as much. It's such a wonderful resource to have. So
absolutely, we appreciate you joining us today, Dr. Springer.
Glad to be here, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
All right, you do the same.
Thanks for joining us today on the Rock Ag Podcast. If you would like any more information on the content of this podcast, please contact Garrard Coffey at the Rockcastle County Extension Office. Please remember to like, subscribe, and share our podcast.